Trying to get to the point. And don't forget the things we've covered about the ceremonies in the Old Testament, the Torah, because they impact directly what we're talking about. And to get us to the point we are talking about, but when Christ appeared as high priest, he entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing eternal redemption. So last week we covered 15 and a little bit of 16. Therefore, he is the mediator of a new covenant, and we spent some time talking about when the writer of Hebrews is using this term mediator, what he was talking about specifically. So Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, which we will talk about the new covenant today, I think, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant. Now that's kind of a setup for what comes in 16 and 17. Since a death has occurred, what that death is specifically is what verses 16 and 17 are pointing toward. Since a death has occurred, verse 16, where a will is involved, the death of the one who made it must be established. For a will takes effect only at death, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive. We talked about all of these examples in the Old Testament where Moses mediated between God and the children of Israel. So that's the example of the mediator that is being referred to in verse 15. Keeping that in mind, because that's kind of a direct connection to what we have to get to verse 18, which is where he speaks of Moses. He brings Moses up specifically. So this is the mediation example for what Christ is doing as mediator for us and God the Father. And then we got to verse 16 and 17, where we have to talk about the will and the one who made the will. And specifically, the two terms that are involved there, the two Greek words that are involved, diathēkē and diathēkē. These two terms are all through the New Testament. They are specifically all through the book of Hebrews, where we've already seen it used a lot. It's used 14 times in total out of the 30 times it's used in the New Testament. And everywhere else it's translated covenant. But in these two verses, they change the use and change it from covenant to will. As an example of the other places it is used, I showed you Mark 14:24, where Jesus said, "This is the blood of the diathēkē." The diathēkē in the King James Version here is translated New Testament, but it literally is covenant. That's all it is. So this is the blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. The word covenant, diathēkē, is basically, in our terms, a contract. All these other words are used for it in English: a will, a covenant, a testamentary, which is what a will is, an agreement, a deed, a deal. And I pointed out that often, especially in the past, and especially with the word deal, you hear people cutting him. You cut a contract, you cut a deal. And that's from the source of the original meaning in covenant, which one example of in the book of Genesis 15, the covenant with Abraham, which is the one that's going to become important as we talk about this further. On the day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, "To your offspring I will give this land." When the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. And the pieces refer to where he told him in verse 9 to bring a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he brought him all these, and he cut them in half and laid each half over against the other, but he did not cut the birds in half. This was the way a covenant was established. In lieu of signing a piece of paper, which they did not have, this is how you sign the contract. You take the animals, you cut them in half, you lay them on either side, and you pass between them, in this case specifically, and in, as part of the ceremony, with this smoking pot of fire. This is important as well in how we approach this verse. So with all that established, we have another example of what we were just talking about. And this particular example points out why this becomes important. This is God talking to Israel through Jeremiah. You recently repented and did what was right in my eyes by proclaiming liberty each to his neighbor, and you made a covenant before me in the house that is called by my name. Part of Jubilee was releasing the slaves from their obligation. So what he's talking about here in verse 15 is that very thing. They had not been keeping Jubilee properly and releasing the slaves, freeing their slaves from the obligations that they had incurred. So they were just blowing right through Jubilee, and because they didn't want to give up their slaves. So that's why he says, you recently did what was right by each to his neighbor, and then made a covenant before me that you were going to keep it from now on. So they went back and made reestablished the covenant to do this going forward. But then you turned around and profaned my name when each of you took back his male and female slaves. So they still weren't willing to give them up, whom you had set free according to their desire. So they just went back and collected them all. And you brought them into subjection to be your slaves. Thus, says the Lord, you have not obeyed me by proclaiming liberty, everyone to his brother and to his neighbor. Behold, I proclaim liberty to you, to the sword, to pestilence, to famine, declares the Lord. I will make you a horror to all the kingdoms of the earth. So for violating the covenant that you established, I'm going to punish you in this way. Now we get a full description of what he specifically means, and this is very helpful. And the men who transgressed my covenant and did not keep the terms of the covenant that they made before me, I will make them like the calf that they cut in two and passed between its parts. The officials of Judah, the officials of Jerusalem, the eunuchs, the priests, and all the people of the land who passed between the parts of the calf. And I will give them into the hand of their enemies and into the hand of those who seek their lives. Their dead bodies shall be food for the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth. The reason that the ceremony to ratify a covenant, to ratify a contract that Abraham and God did, that you also see in Exodus with Moses and the children of Israel, is explained here. Because what you're saying by taking those animals, cutting them in two, and walking between them is, if I violate this covenant, this is me. And that's what we see happening here. Because these people violated the covenant, they paid the price, which meant they became like the pieces of the animals. So that's how this was supposed. This is the imagery that the ratification of the covenant implies. This is what you're supposed to see out of this whole process of walking between the parts. So to get back to where we were with verses 16 and 17, because we're focusing here on this notion that everywhere else in the New Testament, when it uses this word, diathēkē and diathēmai, it's translated covenant, but here they changed it to will when they did the translations, which changes the meaning and gives us a quandary. So in English, when we read this in English, it takes our brain in a direction. If you make a will, it only works if you die. Until then, it doesn't mean anything. You can change it, do whatever you want to it, because a will only comes into effect when you die. So somebody has, the one who made the will has to die before anything happens. And that's the way we take this. And that is exactly the way it's meant. if you use the word will, especially, and if you translate diathēkē here in this way, the one who made the will. But if you take what it represents in the Old Testament and understand it in those terms, it cannot mean exactly what we're reading here. And the reason that's important is verse 15 is clearly talking about the Old Testament, the laws in the Old Testament, the ceremonies in the Old Testament. Verse 18 goes where? Therefore, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood, for when every commandment of the law had been declared by Moses to all the people, he took the blood of calves and goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, this is the blood of the covenant that God commanded for you. So we go right back to that. So we've taken what was at the time a Roman and Greek version of law. Testamentary law with a will was a Roman and Greek concept. Because if you read through the entire Old Testament, where have you ever seen anybody leaving a will? There's not a will in the Old Testament. Because the law established inheritance. There was a process in the law for inheritance. So you did it a certain way because of the law. You didn't have to make a will. It happened the same way every time for everybody. So that's different from what you get on the other side of that. The people around that came to dominate Israel at the time of the first century had wills. They could leave certain things to certain people or nothing to anyone. So you had to have a will. And that's where we understand that verse. If you translate it the way it's translated by just about everybody that I've ever seen, you're taking the people that he's writing this to, and you're assuming that they understand it the way we understand it in that Greek and Roman way, which is entirely what he may have meant to do. But if he did that, it tells us for certain that he wasn't writing to Jews in Jerusalem, because Jews in Jerusalem wouldn't think in those terms. Jews living in a Greek and Roman environment, Antioch, Asia Minor, up where Paul spent a lot of his time, they might be thinking that way because they are really more Roman and Greek than they are Jewish in the sense of their heritage. So they did think in terms that were more, the term we use for that is Hellenistic. So that's a possibility. But what he has done is he's left the context he was in and changed the context completely. And then he goes right back to the context before. And in that way, we understand it to be testamentary law the way we think of it, the way it's translated. So it could be that way, but it doesn't have to be that way. Because it also will work staying within the context he was in. But you have to understand how these words work for that to be the case. Now, this is the covenant that he talked about previously. As I said, Jeremiah 31. This is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days. I will put my laws into their minds, into their hearts. I will be their God. They shall be my people. So the law that this new covenant that he's talking about, he's already established in chapter 8. So when it says Jesus is the mediator of the new covenant, this is the new covenant that he's talking about, because this is what he established it to be in chapter 8. And where he quoted it extensively in Jeremiah, that this covenant is the one Jesus is the mediator of. So think about this problem that we encounter now, because you kind of read over this and you don't pay attention to it. He says that for a will to take effect, the one who made the will has to die. If you take that completely literally, then God made the will. Who has to die? God the Father. So we know that can't happen. So the way we read this is because we read it from a Trinitarian perspective, and there's nothing contradictory in any of this. He's referred to the Trinity himself just prior to this. Mentioned all three members of the Trinity in one verse. So there's no reason that won't work, but thinking of it trinitarily, we insert that Jesus made the will. So Jesus dies and the will comes into effect. But that doesn't work if you apply the same testamentary law that we're applying to make it work. Because where there's a will involved, the one who made it has to die. So how do you make a will? You've got the people who are the inheritors, who don't really have any say in the will at all. And then you have the person making the will. And then when that person dies, what happens? Who gets involved when that happens? The lawyer, and he would be the mediator. So does the lawyer have to die for the will to take effect? And who's the mediator? He just said who the mediator is. So we've created a problem. If you pay attention to the context, and you don't change the context the way we have, and you keep it in the Old Testament traditions, it's not a problem. We don't have a problem at all. But you change the understanding here. You take, now this is the part that the reason we don't want to do this, generally speaking, is we take the Trinitarian piece away. It no longer bolsters the argument for Trinity. But you don't need this to have Trinity. But that's one of the only reasons not to do this. So all the translators do this. Probably because if they didn't do this, you have to really understand all the complexities of what's taking place with the sacrificial signing of the covenant. And people generally wouldn't make the connections, they wouldn't understand it. But I'm going to try to make the connections for you. What's taking place here with these two words, so this is the word covenant, and this is the word for the one making a covenant. This is what it literally says. Okay? This is as close as we can really get to a word-for-word translation. Because for covenant, in other words, if you're going to have a covenant, death necessity carries the himself covenanted. So and remember we talked about that whole middle voice thing a couple of weeks ago? This word is in the middle voice. So that's why it's himself covenanted. So it directly ties to the person who's making the covenant. It's the covenant, the one who makes the covenant himself. Death, he, the one making the covenant himself, carries, and that's the word Pharaoh, which we don't really see the way it gets translated in our case, in most cases. He himself carries the necessity of death. It doesn't say he has to die. It literally says it's the one who makes the covenant's necessity to bring about death. So it can mean he has to die, but that also means what? It's his responsibility to supply, cut the animals, and walk between them. And that remains completely in context with what we've been talking about. Right? Verse 17. For covenant upon death is confirmed. Very simply, you don't have a signed covenant until that death happens. If you make a covenant and you don't do this, you haven't signed it. If you make a contract and lay it down and there's no signatures, it's worthless. So that's what this says. Covenant is only finished when there's a death. And since no way in force while lives the himself covenanted. Now that's a little hard to work out, but ultimately, the person who's responsible for the death hasn't done their job. The covenant doesn't come into force if the person responsible for the death has left the sacrifice alive. You follow? So this all works in context. And it applies directly to what Jesus would be doing as the sacrifice. God establishes the new covenant with Jesus as the confirming sacrifice. So we don't have to turn it into a will to make it make very good sense. And we don't have to change the context that we were already in the process. I think the point is, if they tried to translate it this way, people wouldn't make the connections. So they took an easier path because everybody would understand the testamentary law thing because we all grew up Greeks and Romans. Where that leaves us, looking at it from the other perspective, did the writer of the Hebrews accidentally reveal the Trinity So what I just did, here's what I mean. What I just did in explaining all that to you, the writer of Hebrews could have been very careful with his language and made clear what he meant, and then it wouldn't have been possible to translate it will and the person who made the will. But instead, the words came out the way they came out. And so the translators then made it will and the one who made the will. So in doing it the way the writer did it, did he accidentally leave a reference to the Trinity that could later be used that way? And given that, is that what God intended to have happen? This is an idea that, if you carry it in your pocket, can help you. Because the entire Bible can be read in this context. That we received what God intended for us to receive, even though the people that wrote it didn't mean it that way. So we move on to these 4 or 5 verses, and that's as far as we'll get next week. In fact, maybe for a couple of weeks, we'll see. There's one word here that I want to ultimately center on. Well, let me read these 5 verses. Therefore, not even the first covenant, so the one that we were talking about with Abraham, probably more specifically the one in Exodus with the law as being the first covenant, was inaugurated without blood. For when every commandment of the law had been declared by Moses, so we're in the same context. That was the whole idea. Every commandment of the law had been declared by Moses to all the people. He took the blood of calves and goats, and with water and scarlet wool and hyssop, and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, which is what happened in Exodus, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant that God commanded for you." And in the same way, he sprinkled with the blood both the tent, tabernacle, and all the vessels used in worship. Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood. What better word than purified is there? We talked about this a time or two now. It's the Greek word katharizo. And it better works because it is used this way as cleansed. Because that's what the ceremonies in the Old Testament did. And purified is the same word, but for us it doesn't carry us back to that point. Kind of like what we were just doing in verse 16 and 17. We need to be referred back to what we're talking about. And that's what these atonement sacrifices in the Old Testament did. They cleansed sin, so that you could then participate in the ceremony that, in quotes, removes sin. So the atonement sacrifices cleansed you to do the sacrifices that get rid of sin. Okay. So, indeed, under the law, almost everything is cleansed with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. The shedding of blood is the atoning sacrifice. Does the shedding of blood in the atoning sacrifice forgive sins? We've talked about this too. The correct answer to that question is no. Because remember how the process works. You have sins that have to be cleansed to do the part of the ceremony that gets rid of the sins. The atonement cleanses the sins so you can do the part that forgives the sins. How were the sins forgiven? You loaded them up on a living goat and you kicked him out the door. So he carried all those sins away into the wilderness and just hung out there. We don't know what happens after that. So in approaching this idea of forgiveness, keep in mind that the sins didn't disappear. Literally. It's not like they evaporated into the air. What happened? Put them on the goat, sent the goat away into the wilderness. He still had them, carried them around wherever he went. So what is happening there is God is in the camp. The people are in the camp. The sins get thrown out of the camp. So nobody in the camp, including God, can see them anymore. They're still there, but nobody that matters can see them. That is what's going on in the ceremonies. Out of sight, out of mind. Where this takes us. What is forgiveness? What is atonement? Are they the same thing? We're going to start in the book of Galatians because this perspective that we have on all of this here in Hebrews from the writer of Hebrews is covered by Paul in Galatians. So let's look at the way Paul approaches this subject compared to the way we're seeing it in Hebrews. They're not necessarily contradictory, but they are from two different directions. We're looking at the same thing from two different directions. And then we'll talk very specifically about this. That's where we're going. So we'll pick it up there next week.